Welcome to the debate. There is this prince in the ancient texts, right? And his physical perfection was so legendary that the narrative actually, well, it pauses just to marvel at it.
Oh yeah, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, not a single blemish.
Exactly. I mean, his heavy, magnificent hair was cut only once a year, and its weight was meticulously measured and spoken of throughout the entire kingdom of Israel.
But then, you look at his final resting place.
Right. It wasn't a grand royal tomb. It was a disgraced, desolate pit in a treacherous forest, just, buried hastily under this massive, jagged heap of stones.
And that contrast instantly raises the driving tension of this entire history. I mean, how does a man with absolutely no physical flaw, praised by an entire nation, end up orchestrating the greatest and most devastating rebellion against his own father, King David?
Was it sheer, blinding political ambition? Or, well, was it the inevitable, explosive result of a father's paralyzing passivity?
Right, and a brutal 5-year emotional exile that just completely warped a son's mind.
So today we are investigating the unspoken sin that triggered Absalom's rebellion. By the end of this discussion, we are going to unpack the hidden genealogical motive of a mastermind named Ahithophel.
Which is fascinating.
It really is, and we'll see how a tent pitched on a palace roof perfectly, almost literally, fulfilled a dark prophecy delivered by the prophet Nathan decades prior.
I am really looking forward to unpacking this, because when you look at the collapse of this royal family, the sheer scale of the tragedy is breathtaking and, frankly, deeply relatable on a psychological level.
It is staggering, but I see the root of that collapse as a matter of theological and historical inevitability. When you rigorously examine the text, the actual exegesis of 2 Samuel, Absalom's rebellion is not just a family dispute.
You think it's deeper than that?
I do. It is the unavoidable consequence of a specific unspoken sin. If you frame this conflict around the prophet Nathan's judgment in 2 Samuel 12 and the documented genealogy of David's closest advisor, Ahithophel, you realize this rebellion was a masterclass in political maneuvering, sure.
Right.
But it was fundamentally driven by divine judgment and a calculated, multi-generational revenge plot over David's sins with Bathsheba and Uriah.
I hear you, but I come at it from a very different way. I don't deny the prophetic framework is present in the text, but I view this entirely through the human and relational fracture.
Okay.
This rebellion wasn't just a mystical curse playing out in the background or abstract ancient politics. It was the direct, entirely preventable result of a father's paralyzing silence.
Unpunished crimes and a half-decade of emotional rejection are what forged Absalom's ambition.
So you're saying he was shaped by the trauma?
Exactly. He wasn't born a monster. He was created by unhealed family wounds and a remarkably superficial reconciliation.
Well, to understand the tension between those two views, like the theological decree versus the human fracture, we really have to establish the factual foundation of the royal tragedy.
Right, which begins with Absalom's sister, Tamar, and his older half-brother, Amnon.
Yeah. Amnon becomes obsessed with Tamar, literally to the point of physical illness. So he orchestrates this highly manipulative trap, feigning sickness so King David will send Tamar to his quarters.
Just to prepare food for him. Exactly, and once she is isolated, despite her desperate pleas that this act would bring mutual disgrace, Amnon violates her.
Let me stop you right there because the psychology of what happens next is just staggering. The text gives us this incredibly gritty detail. Immediately after the assault, Amnon's hatred for her was actually greater than the obsessive desire he had just felt.
It is a brutal whiplash.
It really is. He throws her out, locks the door behind her, and Tamar is left tearing her royal robes, putting ashes on her head. I mean, these are the universal ancient signs of deep mourning and absolute disgrace.
She goes straight to Absalom's house, completely desolate.
And for me, this is where the human element completely hijacks any purely theological reading. Because the burning practical question is, why didn't David punish Amnon?
Well, the record explicitly notes that when King David learned of this, he was, quote, extremely angry.
But he takes no concrete action.
None. He doesn't punish him at all.
But wait, he is the supreme judge of Israel. I mean, he executes people for far less. Why is he so paralyzed here?
Well, historically speaking, Amnon was the firstborn. He was the direct heir to the throne. But more than that, David was likely paralyzed by the weight of his own lingering guilt.
Ah, right.
You have to remember the ghost hanging over David's court. Years prior, David had committed a grave sexual sin with Bathsheba and then orchestrated the murder of her husband Uriah to cover it up.
Yeah, it's the hypocrisy.
Exactly. How does a judge hand down a sentence for a sexual crime that perfectly mirrors his own moral failures? His authority was just completely compromised.
That is a compelling argument, but, have you considered what that inaction actually taught Absalom? Because if I am placing myself in Absalom's shoes, his response is chilling.
The 2 years of silence.
Yes, he tells Tamar to keep quiet, and then he enters a 2-year period of total silence. He doesn't say a single word to Amnon, good or bad. He just swallows his rage.
He watches his father do absolutely nothing.
Exactly. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the subsequent rebellion was purely theological destiny. Absalom learned from his father in that paralyzing silence that if justice isn't given by the throne, it must be taken by the sword.
And taken it was. 2 years later, Absalom organizes a sheep-shearing festival at Baal Hazor. Now, a sheep-shearing festival wasn't just farm work.
No, it's a huge event.
Right, it was a time of massive agricultural wealth, abundance, celebration, and it's far away from the capital. It was the perfect setting for a trap.
So he practically forces David to let Amnon attend.
Yeah, and once Amnon is thoroughly drunk, Absalom commands his servants to strike him down. He publicly claims full responsibility for the assassination, avenges his sister, and then immediately flees across the border to Geshur.
Which isn't just some random hideout. We need to explain why he went there.
Right, King Talmai.
Exactly. Geshur is a neighboring kingdom ruled by Talmai, who happens to be Absalom's maternal grandfather. So he is seeking calculated political asylum in an extradition-free zone.
Where David's military can't easily reach him without triggering an international incident.
Right, and this initiates an agonizing 5-year limbo. He spends 3 years hiding in Geshur.
And during this time, David's military commander, Joab, who is a relentlessly pragmatic man, sees the king emotionally torn.
David misses his son, right?
He does, but as the supreme judge, he can't simply overlook a premeditated murder, so Joab uses a wise woman from Tekoa to manipulate the king with a fabricated story about her own 2 fighting sons.
One killed the other, and the village wants the survivor executed.
Exactly. She forces David to admit, legally, that a banished son shouldn't remain cast out forever. David figures out Joab is behind it, but he agrees to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem.
But this is where the narrative takes a profoundly complex and frankly abusive turn. David brings him back to the capital, but refuses to see his face.
For 2 whole years.
Yes, for 2 whole years, Absalom lives in Jerusalem, physically home but emotionally exiled. And this is the logical contradiction that shatters his psyche.
It is a brutal punishment.
Why would a king agree to bring his son back from exile only to place him under house arrest and refuse to exchange a single word with him?
Think of it like signing a peace treaty in public while secretly keeping the borders closed and the embargoes active.
That is a great analogy.
It is a public acknowledgement of reconciliation without any actual treatment of the wound. I mean, it's psychological torture.
It is, and Absalom eventually forces the issue in the most destructive way possible. He summons Joab twice to mediate a meeting with the king, and Joab flat out ignores him.
So he sets the field on fire.
Right. He orders his servants to set Joab's barley field on fire. It is a desperate, violent act, but it works. He tells Joab, essentially, "If I am guilty, let the king put me to death, but let me see his face."
And David finally summons him?
He does. When Absalom bows to the ground, David kisses him.
But the damage is completely done. That kiss was purely formal. You have a total of 5 years where Absalom's identity was shaped by injustice and rejection.
Which hardens him.
Exactly. First, his sister is violated without consequence. Then, his act of what he perceived as just vengeance is treated as a capital crime. 3 years banished, 2 years ignored in his own city. That superficial kiss didn't heal anything.
I see why you think that relational breakdown was the sole catalyst, but Let me give you a different perspective on what happens next, because the scale of the treason points to something much deeper than just a hurt son acting out.
How so?
Well, Absalom begins acquiring chariots, horses, and 50 runners, which are direct, highly visible symbols of royal ambition. But his most dangerous tactic is waking up early and intercepting Israelites at the city gates.
Ah, the grassroots populist campaign.
Exactly. When people came seeking justice from the king, Absalom would intercept them, listen to their case, tell them their cause was just, but then lament that the king had appointed no one to hear them.
Wow.
Yeah, and instead of letting them bow to him as a prince, he would reach out, take hold of them, and kiss them. The text explicitly says he, quote, stole the hearts of the men of Israel.
He is exploiting the exact failure of justice he experienced firsthand.
Precisely.
He is presenting himself as the accessible, empathetic alternative to a distant, compromised establishment. He's saying, the system is broken, but I see you.
And after years of running this shadow campaign, he asks permission to go to Hebron,
Which is David's former capital, heavily loaded with historical symbolism.
right, and Absalom goes under the guise of paying a religious vow. Instead, he sounds the trumpets and declares himself king. And this is where the historical inevitability truly crystallizes for me.
Because of Ahithophel?
Yes, because at Hebron, Absalom manages to win over David's most brilliant advisor, Ahithophel. The text states directly that Ahithophel's counsel was treated practically like the word of God.
His defection was an apocalyptic blow to David.
Absolutely. But to understand the why behind this, we have to separate the facts clearly from the theological interpretation.
Right, because the pivotal historical question here is, was Ahithophel really seeking personal revenge, or was he just a political opportunist who saw the writing on the wall?
Let's lay out the data. First, what the text directly states. Ahithophel was David's trusted counselor, whose defection gave the rebellion devastating credibility.
Okay.
Second, what is historically and genealogically documented in the registries of 2 Samuel, Ahithophel is listed as the father of Eliam, and Eliam is the father of Bathsheba.
Which is just a staggering detail to stumble upon in a genealogy.
It completely changes the landscape. This makes Ahithophel the grandfather of the very woman David committed adultery with, and the grandfather-in-law to Uriah, the loyal soldier David murdered.
That is a huge motive.
Exactly. Now third, what is theological interpretation that Ahithophel's involvement was a quietly nursed, years-long revenge plot? The text doesn't explicitly give us his internal monologue, but the genealogical reality is undeniable.
It provides a profound, bubbling motive for why a man of his standing would risk everything to destroy the king he helped establish.
Right. The most dangerous enemies are the ones you create through your own unaddressed moral compromises.
But wait, is it really a generational revenge plot? Or are we just projecting that onto the text because it makes a great story? Ahithophel was, above all things, a pragmatist. Maybe he just saw that David was a weak, aging king, and Absalom was the winning horse.
Look at Ahithophel's very first piece of advice to Absalom and tell me it isn't driven by a desire to utterly humiliate David.
You mean the tent?
Yes. When Absalom takes Jerusalem without resistance, Ahithophel tells him to take the 10 concubines David left behind and sleep with them in full view of all Israel.
We really do need to explain the underlying logic of that ancient custom, because to a modern listener, it just sounds like sheer brutality.
It does.
Think of it like a hostile corporate takeover where you completely liquidate the former CEO's assets in public.
It burned the ships.
Exactly. It communicated to every citizen that reconciliation between father and son was now permanently impossible. There was no going back.
But you can't ignore the theological layer here, even if you focus entirely on the brutal politics. Because, well, where does Ahithophel tell him to do this?
On the roof.
A tent is pitched on the roof of the palace. That is the exact same palace roof where David first looked down and saw Bathsheba.
That is honestly chilling.
This is exactly where the human maneuvering and the divine decree intersect perfectly. Decades prior, when the prophet Nathan confronted David, he delivered a very specific sentence from God.
That trouble would rise from his own house.
Yes, and that his wives would be taken and lain with in broad daylight before all Israel. The instant Absalom pitches that tent on the roof, he is almost literally fulfilling Nathan's prophecy.
which forces David into this cinematic, agonizing retreat. The great warrior king flees barefoot up the Mount of Olives, weeping, his head covered.
It is a tragic scene.
And as he retreats, a man named Shimei comes out, cursing him, throwing stones, shouting that this is divine retribution for all the blood David shed. David's generals, of course, ask permission to just walk over and execute Shimei.
But David refuses.
Right, he absorbs the curses, wondering aloud if perhaps God ordered Shimei to curse him. David is completely broken here.
Yet, even in his mourning, he remains a brilliant tactician. Before he leaves Jerusalem, he plants his trusted friend Hushai behind to act as a strategic spy.
Specifically to counter Ahithophel's counsel.
Exactly. And this sets up the critical military divergence of the entire rebellion. Ahithophel proposes a surgical strike. He says, "Let me take 12,000 men tonight. I will strike David while he is weary, kill only the king, and the rest of the people will return to you in peace."
It is an incredibly dangerous, highly effective plan. It is exactly what a brilliant strategist would do, cut the head off the snake before it can hide.
But Hushai counters with a masterful psychological lie. He knows he has to buy David time to escape.
So he plays on Absalom's vanity.
Yes. Hushai tells Absalom, "Your father and his men are fierce, like a bear robbed of her cubs. If your initial strike fails, panic will spread." So he suggests gathering all of Israel, a massive, undeniable army, and having Absalom lead them into battle himself.
Promising him all that glory.
Right. And the text makes an explicit theological claim here. It says, God determined to thwart the good counsel of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster upon Absalom.
And Ahithophel knows it immediately?
He does. Possessing a brilliant strategic mind, he realizes the rebellion has sacrificed its momentum and is sealed for failure. So he saddles his donkey, goes to his hometown, puts his affairs in order, and hangs himself.
It is a grim, silent end for the mastermind. But Hushai's espionage works. It buys David the time he desperately needs to cross the Jordan River and regroup at Mahanaim.
Which leads us to the climactic battle of Ephraim's Wood. David tries to march out with his forces, but his troops refuse to let him risk his life.
Right, because he is the symbol of the state. If he dies, it is all over.
But before the troops deploy, David gives a public, explicit order to his generals. He says, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom."
Every soldier hears it.
It is a father's desperate plea echoing above a treasonous war.
And the battle itself is total chaos. It isn't fought on an open plain in meat formations. It takes place in Ephraim's Wood, a dense, treacherous forest full of ravines and thickets.
Right. The text emphasizes a fascinating detail. The forest devoured more people that day than the sword did.
It completely destroyed Absalom's massive numerical advantage.
Which brings us to the most debated, strangely poetic judgment in the text. Absalom is riding his mule through this dense vegetation, trying to escape, when he passes beneath the thick branches of a great oak tree.
And his hair?
Yes, his heavy, legendary hair, the very symbol of his physical perfection and vanity, gets tangled in the branches. The mule keeps running, leaving Absalom literally suspended between heaven and earth.
A soldier sees him hanging there, helpless, and reports it to Joab. Joab demands to know why the soldier didn't just kill him on the spot, offering a massive reward of silver.
But the soldier refuses.
Exactly. His response shows the heavy weight of David's command. He says, "Even if you weighed out 1,000 pieces of silver into my hands, I wouldn't touch the king's son. We all heard the order to deal gently."
Joab, however, operates purely on brutal military pragmatism. He has zero patience for David's emotional conflicts.
Well, how can you run a state if you leave the leader of a treasonous rebellion alive? Joab knows that as long as Absalom breathes, the kingdom is divided. He can't afford a father's love in a civil war.
So Joab takes 3 javelins and plunges them into Absalom's heart while he is still alive in the oak tree. 10 of Joab's armor-bearers then surround the prince and finish the job.
And his body is taken down, thrown into a large pit in the forest, and covered with a hasty, massive heap of stones.
And the contrast there is just devastating. The narrative points out an incredible discrepancy regarding Absalom's legacy, too.
Right, between chapters 14 and 18.
Exactly. Earlier in 2 Samuel 14, the text notes that Absalom had 3 sons and a beautiful daughter named Tamar. But in chapter 18, we are told that he built a stone pillar monument in the king's valley because, quote, I have no son to carry on my name.
How do we resolve that?
Well, what remains debated is exactly that legacy. The scholarly consensus is that Absalom's 3 sons likely died very young, well before the monument was erected.
So his grasp for a permanent stone pillar was an act of profound desperation.
Yes. It is a man trying to immortalize himself through architecture because life had denied him an enduring lineage.
Which brings the entire narrative full circle. He built an arrogant, towering, pristine monument for himself in the King's Valley. But his actual burial was a cursed, shameful heap of stones in the middle of nowhere.
No honor, no gentle treatment.
Just a pit.
And the aftermath of this battle is perhaps the most heartbreaking sequence in the ancient record. David is waiting by the city gates for news of the war.
When the messengers arrive,
He ignores the fact that his kingdom has just been saved. He ignores the thousands of men who died for him. His only question to the Cushite messenger is the young man Absalom safe?
and when the messenger confirms the prince's death, David's grief nearly unravels the entire victory.
He climbs to the chamber over the gate, weeping, crying out, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee."
This public mourning is so intense that the victorious soldiers sneak back into the city like a defeated, ashamed army. It gets so bad that Joab has to violently confront David.
Warning him that if he doesn't encourage his troops, he will lose the kingdom.
Exactly.
So, reflecting on all of this from an investigative standpoint, it is clear to me that the physical beauty and charisma of a flawless prince could not outrun the theological weight of this narrative.
The sins of the father.
Right. The unspoken sins of David, his passivity with Amnon, his crimes against Uriah that turned Ahithophel into a generational enemy, all of it culminated in the precise fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy. You simply can't separate the oak tree from the divine judgment on a fractured royal house.
That is a fair point, though I would still frame it differently. I agree the history is remarkably complex, but the real insight for me remains deeply relational.
How so?
Charisma, beauty, and political cunning just cannot substitute for character. The rebellion wasn't purely an abstract prophecy playing out. It was the result of a father who failed to protect his daughter and who thought a superficial kiss could cure 5 years of silent rejection.
A superficial reconciliation is often far more dangerous than outright exile.
Exactly.
Well, there is certainly more to explore in the depths of these texts. We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the theological judgments against the human fractures.
Because the lasting image remains a prince with perfect, legendary hair, weighed down by the unhealed wounds of his father's house, left hanging in the forest.
An unspoken sin that silently shaped the fall of a kingdom.